Okay. Hi everyone, we've just hit the broadcast button. We'll just wait a few seconds to let people connect properly and then we'll kick things off. Hope you're all having a good day. Okay, well let's start. I think good afternoon everyone and welcome to the latest edition of our Communities in Transition webinar series. So today's webinar is about transitioning to the circular economy in food and agricultural systems, reducing waste, unlocking new value and improving resilience. So in a moment, I'll introduce you to our speaker for today, which is Mark Barthel. But before I do that, I'll just give you a really brief recap on if I can get my slides to change. Okay, here we go. Here's a problem. They don't want to change. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare again, I think. See if that works. No, for some reason my slides don't want to change. I hope you don't have this issue, Mark, but we'll see. But just briefly, I just wanted to say a few words about the Communities in Transition program. So the Clean Growth Choices Consortium has been working with 6 Queensland communities, and that is Cooktown, Charters Towers, Rockhampton, Goondiwindi, Barcaldine and Emerald. And we've been working with those communities for around about 2 years, working closely with them to develop roadmaps and some business cases for them to look at what their future might be for the communities and looking at the economic, social and environmental impacts. So there's a website there, which is www.cleangrowthchoices.org.au, because you can't see my slides, I'm sorry. So you can have a look at that website and have a look at the business cases and the roadmaps. And now I'd like to introduce you to our very special speaker, which is Mark Barthel. Oh, what a shame, Mark. I had a lovely slide with your picture.
Sorry, we're probably sparing people.
So Mark is a special advisor to the Fight Food Waste CRC, and he's leading the development of a food waste reduction roadmap with Woolworths supermarkets, and some really amazing work and statistics he's just been telling me about with that work. He's also supporting the Food Innovation Australia and Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment in the implementation of Australia's National Food Waste Strategy. So Mark has a 25-year track record of driving sustainable innovation and circular thinking in agri-food. And he's worked on preventing food loss and waste and led product and packaging innovation projects in the UK, Europe, North and South America, Africa and Australia. So I hope you have a bit more luck than me, Mark, because
give it a go.
We'll give it a go with the slide share.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a good day. I'm going to take you through, it worked, through a series of slides, and I'm going to focus on 6 topics and then sum up today. So I do want to do a bit of kind of contextual scene setting and talk about reframing the opportunity for the circular economy and for reducing food waste, the sort of opportunity that brings us. Talk a little bit about how circular we are in food systems right now. We don't really know how circular we are in Australia, so I'll kind of be quoting from some global figures. Talk a bit about the business case for tackling food waste and how multifaceted that is. And then talk a bit about sort of holistic thinking around food systems and food systems thinking, and some of the work that I've been involved in sort of operating at the kind of landscape scale and building partnerships at the landscape scale to improve resilience in agri-food and to really make sure that multiple uses of the land are available when they need to be. And then for the last two sections, I'm going to introduce you to the roadmap for reducing Australia's food waste by half over the next 10 years. Just talk you through some of the critical building blocks and activities that we are just getting off the ground there at the national level. And then a sort of series of case studies under the heading of the art of the possible, just talking about some of the work that's been going on elsewhere and in Australia to reduce food waste and provide for a more kind of circular food system. And some quite interesting case studies around also how to unlock new value from the materials in food waste streams as well. So if I start with the reframing, and apologies for all the words on this slide, and I'll just pick a few of these out. So this is actually part of a brief we've just done for the Federal Cabinet Minister, Susan Lee, and the Assistant Minister, Trevor Evans, who deals with the sort of food waste and environmental protection portfolio in the federal government. And really what we're trying to do here is contextualise what this opportunity in terms of circularity and tackling food waste means for everyone at this particularly strange time we find ourselves in. So we believe that if we can push towards a more circular food system and reduce food waste, then it's going to make it a lot easier to cope with what I can only describe as unprecedented food supply and demand volatility. You know, I mentioned to Penny just now that in my work with Woolies, they've had over the last 6 weeks since really the COVID lockdown started, they've had effectively 6 Christmas weeks in terms of the scale of the uplift they've had in sales and product volumes. So everyone's at home, everyone's trying to feed everyone at home, there's no access to restaurants anymore. And this has led to quite a lot of volatility across the food system, with retail at one end requiring 30 to 35% more food at the same time as restaurants and hospitality are effectively shut other than for takeaway food. So there's had to be a huge reshaping of the supply chain, and we just feel that, you know, this is for reducing food waste in particular, this is a great opportunity to introduce some stability into food supply. We've also seen most of the major food companies relaxing particularly their cosmetic quality standards. So it's a real opportunity to actually generate more income if you're in primary production or food processing or manufacturing, because there's the chance that you can actually significantly increase crop utilization with what is effectively a whole crop purchase regime going on, particularly in retail right now. And then on the environment side, just thinking about what are the opportunities in circularity and maintaining, you know, agricultural materials in the economy for longer, and in reducing food waste, particularly in the context of water stress in some of our river basins in Australia. So a real opportunity to improve water stewardship there. And then at the kind of micro level in our households, there are 2 things really that struck me recently. When I was pretty shocked to see last year when Food Bank published their hunger report, which is an annual report which looks at food insecurity in Australia, that their latest survey suggested that 5 million Australians had experienced food insecurity in the last year. Now we know that since COVID started, in the first 5 weeks of COVID, a further 1.6 million Australians lost their livelihoods. So I can't even begin to imagine what that's doing in terms of increasing food insecurity, particularly in regional and remote areas. So as much food as we can possibly get hold of needs to go to those that need it. And so, you know, one of the things we've been working on recently with Woolies and through some of the work at the federal level is scaling up food rescue and relief in Australia. But to do that, we need to get access to that surplus food, and we can't be wasting it. And then finally, how do we help cash-strapped Australian households to better manage their food? So there's a kind of an awareness raising, behaviour change, skills implementation requirement there to really make sure people are getting the most of the food that they're buying or growing and saving some money at the same time. So I'm going to leave it there, but you can see from this slide, we believe there are kind of multiple benefits in this current situation to pushing the food system to being more circular and reducing food waste in the system as well. So in terms of circularity, how circular are we? And as I said, this is a slide that represents, kind of summarizes some work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have done in the UK. But it's, so the title of the research is Cities and the Circular Economy for Food. And I think if you look at these numbers here in this slide, and you see that, you know, 4.3 billion tons of food annually is grown for human consumption, and close to 3 billion of that goes into cities, that this research is a pretty good indicator of circularity across the whole system, the whole food system, whether you're talking about food required for cities or food required for people outside of cities. And you'll see there that in terms of overall circularity and maintaining the natural resource within the food system, we are not even really 2% circular in the food system. And we have an enormous amount of organic waste in cities in particular, where you've got concentrations of population. So we have a double whammy, really. We've got a lot of food being wasted in cities. That then creates an organic waste issue. And we have a disconnect between how where that organic waste is occurring and where it's needed in agriculture and horticulture. So I know some of the work the federal government's been doing recently, and the state-based governments have been doing around food organics and garden organics, and getting better organic waste treatment facilities into Australia is really starting to pay off now, but it's still fairly underdeveloped compared with other parts of the world. So key message here, we're not very circular. So I want to take you through food waste now. This is the kind of global view of food waste, and I'll go on to the Australian kind of snapshot of where we are, situational snapshot of where we are in a second. So this is just to give you an idea of the magnitude. So we were struggling for a while to kind of figure out how do we characterize global food waste. So one of the ways we've done that is to imagine that if global food waste was a country in its own right, what would it look like? And as it turned out, it would be consuming somewhere in the order of 32% of global food supply by weight, at a cost of around 1.8 trillion Australian dollars a year. It will be using 25% of all water used in agriculture, and around 23% of all the fertilizer used on the planet. And it would be consuming somewhere in the order of 1 in 4 of all food calories available to humans and to animals. So it's a pretty big issue. There's a lot of wasted resource, a lot of lost opportunity there. And from an environmental perspective, it would be the 3rd largest carbon emitter after the USA and China. So global food waste and the emissions associated with global food waste account for 8% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is phenomenal. This is a really big greenhouse gas issue. And on the cropland utilisation side of things, we are effectively unnecessarily using a cropland area the size of China. And to put that into context, the entire Australian landmass only equates to 82% of China's landmass. So we're wasting more than all of the area of Australia on producing food that then gets wasted. That's a pretty kind of shocking place to find ourselves in. And what does that look like across the major food groups? So this is a piece of research by the Boston Consulting Group, which has kind of helped to unpick some of the work by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. But you can see here that particularly with roots and tubers and fruit and vegetables, we're in a situation where close to a half of production of those foods is lost or wasted before it can be consumed by humans or animals, which is pretty shocking. And where we've got things like the higher value foodstuffs like fish and seafood, even there we see 35% being wasted through things like bycatch and sea discard, and just lack of cold chain infrastructure in some cases. So it's an awful lot of waste going on here. This is all, by the way, in US dollars, not Australian dollars, the numbers underneath, which create the values. So what's going on in Australia about this? So at the end of 2017, in November, the Australian federal government published its National Food Waste Strategy. And you can see from the framework for action, it was looking at 4 kind of key areas to work within to try and halve food waste by 2030, which is the target that's set in the National Food Waste Strategy. So looking at how do we create supportive policy frameworks to help less food from being wasted, business improvements, so technology adoption, encouraging collaboration, encouraging the normalisation of food waste consideration into business practice, market development, and behaviour change has to play a huge role here, not just in households, but also in businesses. And since then, we've seen a national waste policy published in 2018 and a national waste policy action plan in 2019, so last year. And both of those reinforce the need to pursue more activity in waste prevention generally across the Australian economy. So they're both quite supportive of the National Food Waste Strategy. So this is the situational snapshot for Australia. So if I start at the top left, as I'm looking at the screen, we have around 7.3 million tonnes of food being wasted in Australia each year. And it's a very unusual food waste profile for an OECD country like Australia, because normally in the OECD countries, we'd expect the vast majority of food waste to be occurring in wholesale, retail, and in homes. But in Australia, it's actually fairly evenly split. So we see 31% of food waste in Australia is occurring in primary production. And as we've started to kind of unpick the reasons for that, we've found that about 2.27 million tonnes of food is not harvested or ploughed back in. And we're trying to get under the skin of that at the moment. But we believe that one of the contributing factors is a constant state of systemic overproduction, and that is reducing or impacting on the economics of harvesting of food. So if you're trying to deliver a crop against a bell curve, of distribution to deliver the quality standards required by retailers and hospitality and food service companies, then you're almost certainly going to be overproducing food. So it's not always economic to be able to harvest the crop in a way you would like to. At the other end of the extreme, we see 34% of food waste occurring in Australian homes, and that bar in yellow there against the households is because that's indicating that 92% of all the food wasted in our homes goes straight to landfill. So there is no opportunity to engage with that mixed food stream beyond something like anaerobic digestion or composting. So very little opportunity to create a situation where you can deploy kind of higher value valorization of food waste. It's close to a quarter, 24% in manufacturing, and then a mix across wholesale, retail, institutional catering, and hospitality and food service in the private sector. So 3 to 4% across those. The one thing I would say is that just because, in particular, food service and hospitality and retail companies have very low wastage rates in their own operations, they're obviously the ones that have the most opportunity to influence where food waste is elsewhere and to reduce it. So that's why I'm doing quite a lot of work with Woolies at the moment to help them to understand that some of their actions can lead to an increase in food waste, and conversely, if some of those actions are changed, we can reduce food waste in the system as well. So how much is this costing? Well, the initial assessment by my employers, the Fight Food Waste CRC, suggested around $20 billion a year of costs relating to food loss and waste. But I have to say, as the data is getting better and new information is becoming available, that is very definitely creeping up towards 25 billion. And we're about to conduct a full-blown feasibility analysis of how easy it might be to deliver that halving food waste target. And I think some of the data already seeing that we're gathering could push it even further than $25 billion a year. And I'll give you an example of why we think that in a second. So just from a carbon perspective again, just from food waste rotting in landfill and generating greenhouse gas emissions like methane, we see about 7.6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions there. We now know there's another 7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions from food waste in the food cold chain. And our current sort of estimate of what that means for Australia is that food waste is going to end up probably somewhere between 5 and 8% of national greenhouse gas emissions. So again, in Australia, this is a very significant issue in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And we see a lot of wasted water as well. So one of the studies from Victoria a few years ago now suggested that we were requiring 475 litres of water per person per day to produce fresh produce, so fruit and vegetables, in Victoria. The Food Bank Hunger Report, which is further down the slide there, I've already mentioned, but it is, there's obviously a social imperative here to reduce food waste as well, because we have 7.3 million tonnes of food being wasted each year and over 5 million Australians going hungry. So we need to do something to rebalance that and to make sure that any surplus food that is out there gets to those people in need. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a few examples. So fruit and vegetables are normally one of the highest wastage product categories. That's pretty much wherever you go in the world. So I wanted to give you a kind of a snapshot of what it looks like. And this is a piece of research from CSIRO, which has been mapping Australian fruit and vegetable losses sort of pre-retail. And you can see there for Queensland that the total production in the blue bar is 1,087 kilotons of fruit and vegetables. And the high loss, the max loss estimate there is about 308 kilotons of food. So we're kind of creeping somewhere between a quarter to a third of fresh produce produced in Queensland is lost or wasted before it reaches a retail supermarket shelf or a restaurant or bar. And you can see there for some of the other states as well. They're in a reasonably similar situation. And just to give you an idea then of what that looks like in terms of individual crops, you can see Victoria there has a massive loss of tomatoes, and we're trying to get under the skin of that. The Sustainability Victoria is doing some work on this at the moment, trying to understand why we have such massive losses there. But you can see for Queensland there's a whole range of crops that are being wasted in quite significant volumes. And this is from the National Food Waste Baseline, I should have said, which was published last March 2019. So here's what the National Food Waste Baseline shows us. So this is, how do you describe this? So this is normally described as the food recovery hierarchy. So on the left-hand side of this slide is what we'd normally think of as the idealized kind of upside down pyramid of what should happen when we're managing our resources better, with minimal food going to disposal in landfill or to sewer, a modest amount in recovery, some being recycled through composting, co-digestion, anaerobic digestion, and so on. As you can see, there are a very large amount of surplus food going to animal feed, nearly 4 million tonnes, and a little under 50,000 tonnes during 2016-2017 was going to food rescue and relief. So the idealised pyramid there, in reality, the reality is nowhere like it. So we see a lot of stuff going straight to landfill or disposal, very little prevention activity going on in Australia, a tiny amount of food rescue, a reasonable amount of animal feed coming out of the surplus food or potentially wasted food there. But we've got a real issue in that we don't have much prevention work going on. And given what I've just said about social need and 5 million Australians going hungry, we certainly need to be rescuing more than 50,000 tonnes a year of food. And the sector is doing its utmost now to increase that and to meet a 50% uplift in demand for food relief over the last 6 weeks. So this is not a pretty picture. And if we're going to halve food waste in the next 10 years in Australia, we have to shift a lot of this activity towards prevention, towards reuse, so food rescue and relief and animal feed, and towards those kind of higher value valorization opportunities. So how do we take those materials and food waste streams and convert them into food ingredients or materials for other industries? And I'll show you what I mean about that a bit later. So this is just looking at value by supply chain, and I just wanted to flag on this slide that the original estimate of food wasted in distribution was $1.7 billion, but a new study by Refrigerants Australia and the Australian Food Cold Chain Council is now suggesting that we're close to 4 billion, so well over twice the value wasted. And so the next slide shows you really what that looks like. So the first table on the left-hand side gives you an idea of how much food in Australia in in these 5 product categories, so fruit, vegetables, meat, seafood, dairy and eggs. We have a total production in Australia of nearly $43 billion, and we have an export market of close to $18.5 billion. And then when you look at the slide next to it, you'll see that the 3.8 billion of cost in losses and waste in the cold chain, the vast majority of that $3 billion is in fruit and vegetable production lost. So 25% of annual fruit and vegetable production appears to be lost in the food cold chain right now. Meat production and seafood production is much better at 3.5%, but given the value of those foods, it's not an insignificant amount of value lost. And then the dairy supply chain seems to be in a much better place with 1% or less of losses. And this is really, a very significant thing. And talking to the Food Cold Chain Council recently, I used the term food cold chain. And one of the members said to me, there is no food cold chain in Australia. There is a fresh food supply chain with intermittent temperature and humidity control. And that's about the best it gets for most supply chains. So we've got a huge body of work to do here in terms of improving cold chain infrastructure from farm to fork and improving what I guess you might describe as human factors. So people leaving refrigerated trucks doors wide open whilst they're delivering to stores and restaurants and so on, and losing all of that chill load in the truck, which is not good for food safety or food quality or food shelf life. So lots of work to do in the food cold chain. So what does a circular economy in food look like? I'm not going to go into this because you'll have these slides available to you later, but it's just, as you'd imagine, if you're trying to create a more circular situation in the food system, there's a whole series of loops here where you're trying to recover food, trying to minimize waste, trying to maximize the sustainability of agricultural production and horticultural production, and really trying hard to recover any wasted material and make good use of it. And I'm going to leave it there, other than to say you'll see there in the bottom right, just below that circle, all the different loop hierarchies from feeding humans to animals to soil. Okay, so very quickly then, business case for tackling food loss and waste. So the good news is, and this is a global average, so this is a piece of research done by an organization called Champions 12.3. So the reference to 12.3 is the UN Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3, which is to halve food waste by 2030. And this is a group of influencers, organizers, retail CEOs, government departments, and so on. They're doing a lot of really interesting work around how to reduce food waste and how to maximize the value of surplus food. And you'll see here that the national average is that for every $1 you invest in food waste prevention, you get $14 in return. And you'll see some of the kind of activities in terms of what you need to invest in red in the middle of that graphic on the left of the slide, and some of the things that can generate income for you to get you that $14 return. And then for more advanced countries that have been working on food waste for some time, like the United Kingdom, where I come from, we've been working on food waste there for 16 years, you see a return on investment as high as £250 for every pound you put into waste prevention. And then the right-hand diagram there just talks about how multifaceted this business case is. It's not just about the economics. It is about fighting hunger, curbing climate change, conserving resources, improving corporate reputation, and so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting and very strong picture for those that want to invest in reducing food waste wherever they are in the food chain. And this is a more local study from Food Innovation Australia Limited. And you'll see from the chart here, when we looked at the global size of the prize in terms of what could we do to improve the competitiveness and the value of the agri-food supply chain in Australia, the 4th most impactful thing you can do there is tackle food waste. So you're looking at a return of between $465 to $775 billion over the 10-year period from 2015 to 2025, and a compound annual growth rate of anywhere between 28% and 35%. So if you work at all in the food industry, you know those sorts of compound annual growth rates are very, very rare. So tackling food waste really does seem to pay. And I should say, just finally on the business case, consumers are beginning to expect this now. They are challenging supermarkets to, to stop rejecting imperfect produce, to relax some of their quality standards as they are now during COVID-19. And that they are, as a group of consumers, very intelligent. They know that just because something doesn't look perfectly shaped or sized, it's still perfectly nutritious and safe to eat. Okay. So just a quick bit on food systems thinking, sort of shifting gear a bit. So food systems thinking really is about taking a more holistic view of how we produce and consume food. So you see there in the circle, we're talking about, on the outside of the circle, we're talking about going through from primary production, transportation through retail to the consumer and so on in that constant circle of food supply. In the top light blue quadrant there, we're thinking about what are the employment ratios, what sort of energy mix are we using, how are we producing domestically and for export markets, and what is the opportunity for economic growth. And then in the bottom there, we're thinking about things like what are the health and nutrition properties of our food system, how food secure are we, what is the food culture we're supplying to, and particularly for livestock, how good are our animal welfare standards. And then at the top in the dark blue, we're thinking about things like water pollution, water stewardship, greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, wastage, and things like deforestation as well. So where we're using forest risk commodities like soy in our food system and needing to take account of sustainable sourcing of those sorts of commodities. So that's kind of just a slightly different way of looking at the food system, but it does take into account consumption and production. And some of the work that's going on now in places like the USA and the UK is looking at how do we bring all of those that influence how the land is used, so those retailers, food service, hospitality companies, landowners, and have a more dynamic dialogue with those that actually manage the land, like farmers and growers. And really this graphic is there to highlight the multiple uses of a piece of land. This is just obviously an example. So we've got some orchards here, we've got some arable crops, we've got some livestock, we've got some grassland for grazing, and then we've got a local town. And really it's just talking about how do we use this land the best for food production, the best for green infrastructure in terms of things like flood alleviation, so that we have a floodplain there on the grassland that the river can overflow onto if it's required in high flow rates. And we have things like how do we manage pollinators better over the land. So this is something that's kind of making or almost forcing people to think beyond the farm boundary and thinking about what is it we can do in terms of new partnerships at the landscape scale to improve the overall utility and multiple uses of land. And it's a pretty neat way of thinking about things, and it's becoming more and more popular. And then just finally, just to talk a bit about the kind of the mix in farming. So I've got some of the examples of kind of agri-tech, I guess, agricultural technology here, and how they are starting to benefit farmers to help them become more circular, to help them waste less in terms of their inputs to the land. So just a couple of examples from this slide where you've got something like controlled traffic farming, where remote sensing satellites are determining where your inputs are going, and the tractor doesn't actually have a driver, it's effectively computer controlled. And where you've got things like variable rate application technology supporting that objective, you can reduce inputs by up to 75% and still get a really good crop yield. They're obviously reducing the cost base in agriculture. And some of the other technologies around harvest health, crop health and harvest monitoring, the use of robotics being used quite a lot in soft fruit picking in Europe and so on. And how does this help you, this kind of agri-tech help you to reduce your costs, to become more circular and to produce less waste? So just very quickly, just talk a bit about the roadmap. This was published in March, so just a few months old. And this is really the kind of the critical building blocks we believe need to be in place to deliver that halving food waste target in Australia. So I think I've mentioned just very briefly the feasibility study. So we've We're trying to improve the quality of the data in the National Food Waste Baseline there. We're trying to get a better understanding of where the food waste hotspots are nationally and state by state, and critically, what are the solutions to those food waste hotspots? And then we're going to be building a series of delivery trajectories between 2020 and 2030 to see what needs to be done where and how much it's likely to cost. So putting together an investment case as well. We're also looking at, we've been talking to a lot of businesses and to state-based and federal government at the moment about launching a new voluntary commitment program with industry to reduce food waste. And this has got a lot of traction now, and we've just finalised all of the thinking around the voluntary commitment, and that's just been signed off by the Department for Agriculture, Water and Environment. So we're hoping that that will go live and we'll start taking signatories to that later in the year. We've already talked about the need for a nationwide behaviour change effort. We need to stop 92% of food wasted in people's homes from going straight to landfill. And we need to do a lot more work on food waste prevention. Got a couple of sector action plans that are live at the moment. One on food rescue and relief, which is already live, which is helping scale up food rescue and relief. And another one, which probably won't surprise you, given what I just said about the food cold chain. We're going to be doing a lot of work with the Food Cold Chain Council and Refrigerants Australia and the major logistics companies around how do we improve the performance and integrity of the food cold chain in Australia. And then the next tranche of sector action plans will most likely be commodities based. So for example, we've had interest from Victoria in establishing a sector action plan for the dairy industry. There's a lot of ongoing research and innovation going on with the CRC, with the CSIRO, with universities and research institutes. And finally, we need a strong independent governance structure, something to coordinate all of this activity over the next 10 years. I'm not going to dwell too much on these because I've kind of already described them. There's a lot more detail in the roadmap. By the way, I should say on most of these slides, you can see I've put click-throughs which allow you to go through and look at the references straight away. So there's a link on this slide to the roadmap on the Department of Environment website. So I'm going to skip over this slide and just focus a little bit on the voluntary commitment program here. So we see 4 programs of work here, and the first one really is focusing on how do we embed the consideration of food waste and food circularity within product design, within buying and sourcing arrangements. Then we're looking at how do we optimize the whole supply chain to produce more with less, so better resource efficiency. The third element is focusing on consumption and changing culture. And the fourth one is looking at how do we scale food rescue and relief, and how do we create more value from food waste streams or surplus food. So I'm just going to talk you through why we're strong believers in a number of things. And the first one here is just experience from the UK. So the UK has had a voluntary commitment program since 2005. Which has been looking at how to reduce food waste and packaging waste hand in hand. And again, I won't go into too much of the detail because you'll be able to read this for yourself, but essentially over the first 10 years of these commitment programs, we've reduced avoidable food waste by 28%, and we've saved the equivalent of $12 billion for food businesses and consumers, and we've achieved an 11 million tonne emission saving as well. So it's pretty powerful stuff, and this is all around really creating a safe environment for pre-competitive collaboration, getting the industry to work together from farm to fork in a way that hadn't been done really before, and this is what we want to do here. Just give you an example from an individual retailer. So I worked with Tesco's for about 6 years, and when I started working with them, food waste in their supply chain represented about 3.5% of sales. Now they're a multi-billion-dollar business, so that is a lot of money to them. We did a hotspots analysis across 72 countries where they source their food from. I'm really hoping it's easier in Australia, given we've got such a large domestic production system here, but we had to look at 72 countries with this UK retailer because they follow the sun on things like fruit and vegetables. So we got multiple production zones being deployed at different points of the year. But in a nutshell, they have effectively reduced their food waste tenfold in 6 years. They've saved billions of pounds as one organisation. They've got their major suppliers to do the same now. And just in the last reporting period over 2018, 2019, they achieved what was close to a 1/5 further reduction in food waste. And what was really impressive was they got very serious about donating surplus food to food rescue, and they increased donations by 63% in 1 year. That was amazing. So their overall target on food waste at Tesco is that no food safe for human consumption should go to waste. And at this point in time, when they reported this in 2019, they were 81% of the way there. So this just gives you an idea of what the art of the possible is as a retailer. Again, I won't dwell on this because of time, but there are a whole load of things you can do to reduce food waste and improve circularity in the food system. Obviously, the one on the Venn diagram on the left is the sort of actions you can take as industry, and on the right, the sort of very simple things households can do to reduce food waste and save money. I probably won't dwell too much on this either, but this is just taken from what we see as some of the indicative activity that we would be doing under the voluntary commitment programme. Just to give you an example of how powerful hotspots analysis can be, Matthew Walker, the case study in the middle of this slide, they produce for what is a very beloved food in the UK at Christmas, the Christmas pudding. They do that they produce them up with up to 60 odd ingredients. And what we found with hotspots analysis was that actually just 5 to 7 of those high impact ingredients made up almost 80% of the total product footprint. So this is how powerful hotspots analysis can be on focusing you on what is important to look at. And the other thing there we did was we challenged Oscar Mayer, who are a pre-prepared food supplier, to look at their microwaving times for pre-prepared meals. They were able to reduce the safe cooking time by 1 minute. And just for what they supplied into Sainsbury's, which is the #2 retailer in the UK, they saved the equivalent energy to power their factory. So they saved the equivalent energy in a single day to power their factories for a whole week. So effectively, by doing that, they made their factories energy neutral. I'm going to move on now to the very simple process we have already been using in Australia, actually, to walk the chain. So we sometimes describe this as whole chain resource efficiency. Some people call it value stream mapping or lean and green supply chain auditing. But it's essentially kind of defining the problem, doing a waste mapping exercise, using hotspots analysis to understand the priorities to tackle, looking at root cause analysis, generating some solutions, and then trialing or embedding change. And the diagram there just shows what happens when you bring together, in this case, a potato supply chain, and you look at mapping the physical materials in that supply chain across farm to fork, and you look at the information flows and where the information processing is going on, and you can start to determine which actions in that value chain are affecting food waste and which could improve them. So from the same study, just very quickly, this was a study we did with Cooperative Food and Farm Care, their major supplier, 5 production zones. We looked at varietal norms, so which varieties tended to waste less between the farm, the paddock, and the supermarket shelf. And we discovered, as one example, that King Edward's potatoes had a 10% less of a wastage rate. So farmers are very used to looking at yield in the paddock and at the farm, not so used to actually looking at yield by the time it gets to a supermarket shelf or a restaurant. And that's what we did here. We tried to understand the longer game in this. We looked at optimum circumference sizes for potatoes because their product specs said that the optimum circumference of a potato was 45 millimeters. We asked them why. After 3 months of hunting, they found the product spec from 1978. No agronomic practice or anything, or consumer acceptability around that size of potato. Reduced it by a very small 2 millimeters. Immediately, the farmers were seeing a 5% increase in crop utilization and $2,000 a hectare more of income. We looked at triple tape irrigation. That led to a 30% reduction in water use and a 4% increase in yield. And you can see there, I won't quote them, but there's a very significant return on investment. And then we looked at refrigerated storage, and we brought, of the 15 refrigerated stores, we brought 14 up to the best-in-class 15th and saved 1 million kilowatt hours of energy a year. And then a few changes to transit packaging generated some further savings. But you see this kind of multifaceted approach in walking the chain. We're looking for all of the opportunities to save money and save resource. And for this particular value chain, that generated $1.2 million of savings per 50,000 tonnes of potatoes harvested. So very significant savings for what is a fairly low margin value chain. I'm going to talk a bit about the maximising value and some of the opportunities in waste valorisation, and I'll probably only give you a few of these examples because I'm conscious of time. So in terms of animal feed, we see just one example here. Edwina, in her pig farm in New South Wales, is now using 100% pig feed manufactured from manufacturing waste to feed her pigs. So significantly reduced costs in terms of pig feed, actually really good quality pork as well at the end of the day. This is just one of the examples of how to start understanding, if you've got a waste stream, how do you get to a co-product? So anything from using surplus blood from abattoir processing and converting that into cultures for vaccine production. So some quite different uses outside of the food system here, to some more traditional aspects like taking the whey from cheese production and putting that into a range of functional foods. Just to talk a bit about some of these closed loop thinking as well. So last year, you may have seen that Woolies introduced a new limited edition pale ale called Loafer, and this was made entirely from surplus bread. So they actually brewed beer from surplus bread. Very, very good taste, won a couple of awards, and they're kind of looking at how can they use bread at a sort of higher volume to produce beer in their supply chain. So they're effectively taking what could have been a wasted resource and creating a higher value product from it. Just another example from the beer industry, this one from California actually. So this is a craft brewery run by these two guys in the picture there. They recognized that 85% of their byproduct from brewing was spent grain. They looked at the nutritional profile of that spent grain and discovered it was very low glycemic, because most of the sugar is obviously taken during the brewing process, but it's high protein and high dietary fiber. So they created a series of healthy snack bars. They created a whole new brand called Regrained. They just introduced a popcorn range for this as well. And they've produced low glycemic flour, which is now being sold to a major baker's in California. So effectively, I guess what I'm saying here, they've got one ingredient stream and they've got 4 product lines coming out of that one ingredient stream. And I love the strap line here with their healthy snack foods here, just eat beer, which really kind of struck me as a kind of amusing, eye-catching, compelling strap line for marketing purposes. Something more simple, and this we are starting to see a bit here. So this is a company called, it's a social enterprise, in fact, called Rubies in the Rubble. You can have a look at that in more detail, but essentially what's happening here is the founder, Jenny Dawson, set this up. She was managing outdoor markets, and she took fresh produce that was about to be thrown away at the end of each market day, and took that, collected it from all the stalls around the markets, and she ended up collecting, I think, from about 50 odd food markets, and converting them into very high value premium ketchups, mayonnaises, relishes, barbecue sauces, preserves, and so on. And the really smart thing she did was to go premium at first. So she was selling into Harrods, Harvey Nichols, Selfridges. These are really premium food resellers. We're now kind of rolling out this model in South America under a UN environment program, and we're looking for partners for Woolies at the moment to see if we can do the same here. And then there's some of the things like BrewDog. So take your surplus lemons and citrus and convert that into a beer. Looking at how do we get 2 products out of surplus carrots. So in this case, it's an award-winning bottled water, but also drying and pelletizing those carrots for use in animal feed. And what really shocked me about this was the animal feed bit. So if you just sell on those carrots as they are, with no processing whatsoever, you'll get about $60 a ton. If you process them and pelletize them, you get $2,000 a ton. So it's just thinking about some very simple processing, transformational processes can really drive the market value of this stuff. Terek Technologies in SA and New South Wales as well, they're taking all of the grape mark waste from wineries and vineyards and converting that into a whole load of different ingredients. So they're converting grape seeds into face care creams, tartaric acid into food ingredients, some grape alcohols for the alcohol industry and the medical industry, and inputs, soil improvers into agriculture and horticulture. So again, a very wide range of new co-products from the same ingredient stream. And then finally, from Queensland, just another example of what you can do with surplus banana crops, and this is natural evolution. So they started off with low glycemic flours from bananas, and they're now producing all sorts of bakery ingredients and even spirits like vodka from the surplus bananas. So I think they told me the other day, they've got almost 40 different products now coming out of this surplus banana stream. So really good opportunity to be more circular, to drive new value, and to reduce wastage on the farm as well. I'm going to stop there, Penny. Would love to hear any questions you might have.
Hey, thanks, Mark. That's the numbers are just mind-boggling, aren't they?
Yeah, they're shockingly bad.
Yes, yes. So there's a couple of comments here that I'll read out to you, and the first one was when you were talking about supply to supermarkets, I think, and the comment was that most large suppliers are contractually obliged to set volumes, so must overproduce to avoid penalties from failure to supply.
Yeah, so this is quite common. When we looked at this in the UK, we thought that the combination of those tied contracts and high contract penalties was probably leading to about 10% overproduction. When we looked at it further in Europe, it was probably about the same number in Europe. I just got this feeling, and I've got no evidence yet for it, but I think it's probably higher in Australia. And it may be to do with the fact that there is less competition in retail. So in the UK, for example, we have 11 grocery retailers. Yes, we have some that are quite big like Tesco, but we've got a broader base. So there is more competition there. Whereas in Australia, if you look at the big four, you're talking about 95% of the market. So I think what I'm kind of hoping for here is that as we go through this interesting period where the retailers are taking all grades of produce because they need them to meet that growing, that 30% uplift in demand, it will be great if we could actually, because they've now become very comfortable with whole crop purchase, if we can persuade at least some of them to retain that sort of commercial arrangement, because that will improve crop utilization. And even when demand goes down and we see the reopening of hospitality, of restaurants and bars and so on, and cafes, there is a big opportunity there for secondary contracting. So you may find one company is contracting the whole crop and then subcontracting to suppliers to produce pre-prepared meals from the grade B produce and things like soups and sauces from the grade C. So again, a much more circular view of the food system. It's proved to be incredibly powerful in Europe and North America, and I'm staggered that it's not here, because the economics just seem to stack up, and most of the people in the value chain benefit.
Mark, you mentioned having to develop the governance structures around this. So yeah, I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that, and how do we drive these changes? So
if I just take the example of the voluntary commitment program, over 30 countries now have voluntary commitment programs like the one we want to introduce into Australia, and 24 of them are pretty advanced. And the commonality across governance and the kind of management of this effort, it's really interesting because most of the organizations running them are at arm's length from government and from industry. So we're in that very interesting grey space. And I think part of the reason for that success is that they're not biased. They're not seen as biased. They're not seen as promoting a government policy position or a business position. They're sitting in the middle of it all. If they do their job well, they improve the trust with all the signatory organisations that might sign up to a voluntary commitment programme. Basically, what I'm saying is they have no axe to grind, and they're seen there as just being there to drive the change, to increase the pace and scale of change. So for me, if I'm looking at the characteristics of a governance entity or a delivery body for this sort of work, then that sort of independence is critically important. Agility is really important. If you're working with, as we were in the UK when I left there, 160 of the biggest food companies in Europe, effectively, you've got to be really agile about the way you make decisions on projects and research and implementation and piloting of new technology. You've just got to be really, really agile. Otherwise, they get frustrated and walk away. And you've got to be able to prove your expertise as well. So the highest performing delivery teams are those that broadly reflect the experience and expertise in industry. So you have people that are product designers, you have people that are involved in commercial contracting and buying and sourcing of food. You've got people there that are really familiar with the waste industry and valorization, so kind of chemical, biological engineering, that sort of thing. And you've got people there that are really, really good at behavior change and cultural change. So for me, it's partly about the characteristics of that governance and delivery entity. It's also about the composition and the mixed skill set of that team that helps companies to deliver against a target.
Okay. We've just got another comment here. With so much food going to landfill from homes, what do you think is holding back FOGO collections in most places? So that's food and garden organics collection.
So this is kind of difficult for me because I feel a bit conflicted on this. So when I showed you that diagram of what the food recovery hierarchy currently looks like, and you can see all of that food going to landfill or to energy from waste, there's a lot of work going on, in places like New South Wales in particular, where they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in FOGO and in treatment plants, and even Woolworths is now starting to invest in anaerobic digestion plants and things like that to manage its own food waste better. I think part of it is around funding. Part of it is around the difficulty in changing household behaviour, so getting people to separate organic waste from their other waste streams and their recycling. And part of it is around actually how difficult it is to make it easy for households as well. So the communication. So if you've got your food waste bin or your food and garden waste bin, you've got the physical thing that you can sort stuff into, but actually the behaviour change effort takes quite a lot of time sometimes. So I think probably people are just a little bit wary of that because they're going to put a lot of sunk investment into the infrastructure, and they need to make sure participation rates are high, and that takes time, and not everyone likes that.
I know there's collection. I'm not sure about New South Wales, but I know that there's the organic collection, curbside collection down in Victoria. So I don't really know how successful or not that is. Do you know much about that?
It is. It's so more and more councils are rolling it out, and I think they've learned a lot of very valuable lessons about how to communicate the new service that's being provided at curbside. And I know that Victoria in particular has gone over to the UK and talked to the likes of RAP, where I used to work, so the Waste and Resources Action Programme, about how they've done it across the UK, because it's available in 95% of local councils in the UK now. So close to 450 local councils. So not far short of how many local councils there are in Australia.
Okay. I've got a question here from Taryn, who's asking what organisations are leading in engaging with industry players to initiate discussion on ways to reduce food waste in Australia.
So at the moment, I would say there are probably 3 leading organisations. So there's the Fight Food Waste CRC, so the Cooperative Research Centre. They're based, headquartered out of Adelaide, but they have 8 university partners doing research into how to reduce food waste and how to create those kind of valorisation and co-product opportunities and how to engage. So, for example, the CRC has last November published the first report of household attitudes and behaviours around food and food waste. So they surveyed nearly 5,300 households in Australia to start building that behavioural baseline to understand why it was, what were the behavioural drivers in Australian homes and how was that affecting food waste. The next phase of that research, which follows what we did in the UK, is to actually do the bin audits. So we understand the difference between those stated behaviours that we've captured in the survey work and the actuality of what's being thrown away. And very often we find that they are poles apart. So in the UK, for example, we had a situation where most households were, who said they were wasting hardly anything or nothing at all, were actually wasting 90 kilos of food a year, so more than their own body weight in food a year. So there's that kind of stated behaviour and actuality, reality gap that we need to be mindful of. So that was Fight Food Waste CRC. The other is FIAL, who I'm seconded to at the moment on the National Food Waste Strategy work. We've been doing a lot of engagement. FIAL colleagues and I have been doing a lot of engagement with the peak industry bodies like the Australian Food and Grocery Council, the National Retail Association, National Farmers Federation, Port Innovation, the RDCs and so on, as well as individual food businesses. So that'll be the other one. And then CSIRO is doing some great scientific work around how to reduce food waste across Australia.
Okay. A question here from Deborah. How significant an issue is Australia's tyranny of distance, decentralisation and low relatively population density in addressing the circular approach?
Yeah, it's tyranny of distance definitely makes it more difficult to be circular. And one of the things that, we've been looking at in some of these emerging sector action plans is how do we find the investment potential, so to transform food closer to a production zone to stabilise it for long distance shipment. And I work in Queensland with the Department for State Development, Manufacturing, Industry and Planning. They are opening up 5 advanced manufacturing hubs. Trying to think where they are. One in Cairns, one in Rockhampton and one in Townsville. And all of those advanced manufacturing hubs have a food component. So there's a lot of research, a lot of food technology available to food businesses in Queensland through those hubs. So, I'd encourage you to take a look at the Department of State Development, Manufacturing, Industry and Planning, God, that's a mouthful, their website, and have a look at their advanced manufacturing hubs, because if you are interested in transforming food for further shipment and so on, then definitely. And then the last thing I would say is the tyranny of distance and the food cold chain, definitely. If you're shipping mangoes from northern Queensland to Melbourne, that's pretty much 3,400 kilometres. And if the cold chain's not functioning terribly well, then you've got very little shelf life at the end of that journey.
I might just put in a quick plug there. So next week's webinar is about a food and fibre cluster out in the Central Highlands region. So there could be a bit more information on that topic. Well, there will be next week's webinar. Just one last question from Julianne or Julian. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Can you please elaborate on processing surplus veg to produce water? Where did it take traction? I heard that it might come up to North or Central Queensland.
No, I saw that particular bottled water. It was at the Food Innovation Awards in Melbourne last year. But I must admit, I can't remember where it came from. But I do know there's a lot of interest now in how do you extract that, the water from things like carrots and other root vegetables. And there's, because they see the two streams there, they see a very pure water source and they see the opportunity to create and to transform that particular surplus crop. So you increase the value. So as I said earlier, from $60 to doing nothing to it to $2,000 once you've pelletized it for animal feed, that's a really significant difference. And pelletization also means that you can supply export markets as well. So a lot of those dried pelletized carrots are actually going to places like Japan, and that, getting really good value per ton for that.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. We might leave it there. Again, the statistics are just mind-boggling, and there is just so much potential, isn't there, to be better.
Yeah, I mean that's the upside of being in a bad situation. It can only get better, and there's a lot of opportunity there. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we'll leave it at that. I don't think I'll try and share my screen again at this stage, but I would again just like to put in a plug for upcoming webinars in this series. So the first 3 webinars that we've had in this series were around agriculture, supply chains, circular economy in food and ag. And starting next week, the next set of webinars will be around dynamic business and place-based workforce, and looking at business clusters and those sorts of themes. So we hope that you're able to tune in and listen to those as well. So thank you again, Mark. You and your team have your work cut out for you. But you know, the everyday people, we need to get on board with it, don't we, to make things happen.
Yeah, everyone has a part to play. What I would do, Penny, because that's such a large file size, that slide deck, I'll send you a link to a Dropbox, and you'll be able to share the same link with everyone else if they want to grab the slide.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, we'll leave it at that, and I hope everyone have a great afternoon, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.